With Kayla Harrison fighting this weekend, who just over a year ago was viewed as one of the best fighters outside the UFC, along with the signing of Reiner de Ridder coming over for one championship, I thought it'd be interesting to look at some of the best fighters outside the UFC. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the best non-UFC fighter in every single weight class. We're going to start off here with the heavyweight division, and this was definitely one of the easiest divisions to look at here. It's got to be Francis Ngannou, the former UFC heavyweight champion who never lost his belt in the octagon. In my opinion, if you were to ask me who the top two heavyweights are right now, regardless of organization, it would be Francis Ngannou and Tom Aspinall. You could pitch me Tom Aspinall as the best heavyweight. You could pitch me Francis Ngannou as the best heavyweight. But in my opinion, it comes down to those two. I think a strong case could be made for either of those dudes. We have not seen Francis Ngannou compete in MMA for a while now, but we're going to get to see him back this October going up against the physical freak Renan Ferreira. So good to see him back, but Francis Ngannou definitely has to get the nod as the best non-UFC heavyweight. I do, though, want to give an honorable mention to Bellator's Vadim Nemkov. He's 18-2, undefeated since 2016. He is the Bellator former light heavyweight champion, so he has wins over Corey Anderson, Ryan Bader, Yoel Romero, 2 wins over Phil Davis, but he just recently moved up to heavyweight, so I think he's definitely someone who's in the conversation and could be a potential future opponent here for Francis Ngannou. Now, looking at the light heavyweight division, I went with Anatoly Malikin, the one championship, 3-weight world champion. Yes, you heard me right. He is the 3-division champion in one championship here. Now, I will say one's weight classes are a little bit screwy because they're not really the same weights as the UFC because they do hydration tests to, I guess, counteract weight cutting. Personally, I don't think those work really well. So like, for example, Flyweight, which in the UFC is 125, you would have to weigh in at 135 for one championship, but you would have to pass the hydration test. So according to one championship, Malikin is the middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight champion. I'd be pretty shocked if he could actually cut down to 185. He's a big dude, so I don't think he'd be getting down there. I think he'd be more of a light heavyweight or a heavyweight if he was outside of one championship. So I'd obviously be going with him here at 205. One strength of schedule is kind of tough to evaluate. I talked about Reiner de Ridder at the top here. Malikin has 2 wins over him. The UFC just signed de Ridder, kind of like a fun guy coming into the organization. And then he won the heavyweight title off of Arjun Buller, who's like not an amazing fighter, but he was a heavyweight in the UFC, went 3-1. So not a total scrub. That's kind of like the issue for a lot of these guys. The strength of schedule isn't ideal. You're likely not competing in super stacked weight classes with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 of these guys. But I do think Malikin's fun. I mean, to win belts in 3 weight classes, really regardless of the competition, is very impressive. Now, looking at the middleweight division, I want to talk about Johnny Eblen here. He is the undefeated Bellator middleweight champion. He's 15-0, won the belt by dominating Gegard Mousasi, who had a lot of success in the UFC, was having a lot of success in Bellator, but Johnny Eblen pretty much shut him out in their title fight. He's defended that belt twice, and then he also won a very close non-title fight win over Impa Kasanganay. It was when they were doing the PFL versus Bellator card, the PFL champs versus the Bellator champs. I believe Impa was the light heavyweight PFL champ, but he was fighting down at middleweight against Johnny Eblen. And Eblen is set to defend his Bellator title in a rematch against Fabian Edwards, the brother of Leon Edwards. I really wouldn't be shocked if we saw him in the UFC within the next couple of years. It seems like that's where he wants to go. He wants to fight the best of the best. He's already kind of been hinting at it. Seems like he's not overly satisfied with like the Bellator PFL merger here. So I think out of a lot of these guys I'm talking about, he's probably one of the more likely guys who could make the jump into the UFC. Now, shifting over to the welterweight division, I will say this was probably by far the toughest division to go between. And I wasn't just choosing between like 2 or 3 guys. I think you can make the argument 4, 5 potential contenders here to be the best non-UFC welterweight. So the first one I was looking at here was Ramazan Kuramagomedov, who is the Bellator champion. He's got a name on him, but he's undefeated, 13-0. He won the belt over Jason Jackson, who I think a lot of people were really high on after he won the belt in a dominant win over Yaroslav Amosov, who was a 27-0 fighter. So he beats the guy that had the huge win. A win over Jason Jackson is very impressive, so he's definitely in the mix. I think we have to look at Christian Lee from One Championship. He is their lightweight and welterweight champion, has 6 title wins. He's only 26 years old, but he hasn't fought in almost a year, and the quality of competition is still kind of up in the air with One Championship just because there's not a ton of crossover between these different organizations, or at least like the UFC, Bellator, PFL over to One. And then the other 2 guys I want to talk about here, they're actually scheduled to fight in the PFL Championship for $1 million. It is Magomed Umalatov and Shamil Musayev. So Umalatov, 17-0, 13 finishes, 11 knockouts. Musayev, 19-0-1. So both these guys have not lost in MMA, also with 13 finishes, and also has 11 knockouts. If I was forced to pick one for the best non-UFC welterweight, I would go with Umalatov. But like I said, I think there are a lot of quality options out there. You could also throw in Magomed Karimov, who has won the PFL tournament twice. He's had some weird visa issues. I think he's hurt right now, hasn't fought in nearly a year, but he has a great record and has, a very productive run in PFL. Now, looking at the lightweight division, this one seems pretty clear, a pretty easy pick. I feel like we have to go with Usman Nurmagomedov, 18-0. Only 26 years old, obviously comes from that Nurmagomedov team. He has 3 Bellator title wins. I could easily see him right now being a top 5 UFC lightweight. We're probably not going to see that, as long as Islam Makhachev is there as the champion. But he's very well-rounded, 8 knockouts, 6 submission wins. I'm hoping we get to see him fight AJ McKee next. That's the fight I would really want to see. And if I had to give an honorable mention for the lightweight division, it would be AJ McKee, who's also, I think, a great fighter with a very, very bright future. Now, shifting down to the featherweight division, this is where we're actually going to go to KSW here. Could have gone to featherweight with a guy like Brendan Loughnane. Could have gone with Patricio Pitbull, who I do think would be an honorable mention. Someone who's had a great career in Bellator, 13 title wins. I just think for Pitbull, he's 37, probably past his prime at this point. I actually went with Saladin Parnasse from KSW. He is 19-2. He's 26 years old. He is the KSW featherweight and lightweight double champ. And one of his 2 losses was actually him going for triple champ status. So he was going up to 170, trying to become a 3-weight world champion simultaneously. He has finished 5 of his 7 title wins. He has 4 knockouts, 7 submissions. I think he's a super interesting fighter. Believe he was kind of in talks with the UFC, but ended up re-signing with KSW. So we'll probably see him with KSW for a little bit longer, but maybe someone who eventually makes the jump to the UFC in the future. Now, maybe the best guy I'm talking about here, maybe not the best, but top 3, top 5 in terms of these non-UFC fighters, Patchy Mix in the Bantamweight division. I truly believe you drop Patchy Mix in the UFC Bantamweight division, I think he is a real contender for the belt there. You can make an argument that he is a very tough stylistic matchup for the current champ in Merab. Mix is 20-1. He has a huge frame for bantamweight, 5'11", 71.5-inch reach. You look at Bellator's 135 division, I talked about how for a lot of these non-UFC weight classes, there's not a ton of depth. The quality of competition isn't super top tier. That is not the case for the Bellator bantamweight division. Patchy Mix has finishes over Sergio Pettis, Rafian Stotts, Magomedov. He also has decision wins, another one over Magomedov, and then Kyoji Horiguchi. This is a high level of competition. These are guys who I do think could be top 15 in the UFC. Sergio Pettis has had UFC success. So has Kyoji Horiguchi. I think Stotts, Magomedov. These are also guys who could be very competitive if they were in the UFC. So Patchy Mix, super fun fighter, and I do think he would be the clear top pick here at bantamweight. And I would love to see some of the matchups he could have in the UFC, going up against Sean O'Malley, going up against a Merab, guys like that. Just great jiu-jitsu, like I said, huge frame. So it could be someone who makes that leap and could pose problems for the current 135ers. Now the final men's weight class here, flyweight, I'm going with Demetrius Johnson. Maybe this is cheating because he just retired from MMA, but I think you could make the case that right now, Demetrius Johnson is still the best flyweight in the world. The last time we saw him lose in the UFC was a split decision, pretty much a 50-50 fight to Henry Cejudo. Obviously, Henry Cejudo, no longer in the mix there in the flyweight division. Since leaving the UFC, he went 5-1. He avenged his only loss by beating Moraes in their second and their third fights. His longevity has been truly amazing for a guy who's already undersized. He is a small 125er and in the lightest weight class. Typically heavyweight, light heavyweight, you can get guys competing into their late 40s, or sorry, into their late 30s, early 40s. You do not see that at flyweight, bantamweight. Like, you're pretty much past your prime when you hit like 35 years old. Demetrius Johnson, I believe he's 38 years old, could still be very competitive with a lot of these guys. So Demetrius Johnson is going to be my pick. And then shifting over to the women's weight classes, starting off with women's featherweight, which I guess is no longer a thing within the UFC, but definitely some of the top non-UFC women's fighters, Chris Cyborg, Larissa Pacheco, these are great women's fighters here. And they would be the two, right? These two are set to face off, Chris Cyborg, Larissa Pacheco, on that Francis Ngannou card. The division outside of these two is pretty much non-existent. Like, the quality of competition is not great, and these two are head and shoulders above everyone else. But we get to see them fight in October. So I guess if I have to pick, I would lean towards Pacheco, but we'll actually get to see, who truly is the best here. Chris Cyborg, one of the greatest women's fighters of all time, 27-2. I think people who are just locked in on the UFC, all they really remember about her is her, loss to Amanda Nunes. That loss was the last loss she's had, only 2 losses in her career. She's amazing, has a ton of finishing ability. Same with Larissa Pacheco, who is the only woman to beat Kayla Harrison. So she beat Kayla Harrison in the PFL championship, to win the $1 million. She has won the last 2 PFL seasons. So this is going to be a great fight. 2 very powerful women, both have, a ton of finishing upside. Should be a very fun fight. Looking at women's bantamweight, outside the UFC, this weight class is pretty much non-existent. Even within the UFC, it's pretty much non-existent, aside from a few top options. So I really don't even have anyone for this weight class. Women's flyweight is actually pretty fun outside the UFC. My pick is Dakota Dacheva from PFL. And the PFL women's flyweight division is pretty decent, at least in terms of the top. You have, Dacheva, who I mentioned. You have Taila Santos, who is the former UFC title challenger. A lot of people think she actually beat Valentina Shevchenko in their fight. You have Liz Carmouche, the former Bellator champ and UFC title challenger. And then Jenna Bishop, who I think is like an interesting, piece of that division also. Dacheva's 13-0. She is only 26 years old and has pretty unique finishing ability for this weight class. I'm not going to say she's faced the best competition, but she has 12 finishes in 13 fights, 11 knockouts, 1 submission. She has a super, super fun style, and she is going to be facing off against Taila Santos in the PFL's 125 championship. So if she can get past Taila Santos, that really is going to be the fight to determine who the best here outside the UFC is. But if she can get past Taila Santos, and if she finishes Taila Santos, you can make a very strong argument that she would be the best women's flyweight in the world. A fight between her and Valentina Shevchenko would be absolutely amazing. Would love to see it. Maybe we get it in the future. Not sure if the timeline is going to line up with Valentina, kind of older, only 26 years old here for Dakota. But if that fight happened right now, a year or two, sign me up for that. And then the final weight class here, women's strawweight. I have Stamp Fairtex from One Championship. She is One's atomweight champion, but that would be UFC strawweight if she were to, transition over. She's 11-2, 27 years old. She's coming off a title win over Seo Hee Ham, who had a lot more experience than her. She's a really fun striker. The level of competition in the wins, somewhat questionable, but I would have her here as the best women's strawweight. And that's going to wrap it up for the best non-UFC fighter in every single weight class. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you have some different picks, would love to hear them down below. But thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.